Now let's think just a little bit. We've had 6 days, creation, wonderful situation. And now we've talked about the natural way to look at creation. And what we're going to move into now are 3 very depressing and negative judgments that God brings upon us as a people. And they come in 3 different forms, these judgments. The first one will be universal. The entire universe is affected. The second judgment will be that the entire earth is affected. And the third judgment that we will discuss this afternoon, both of these, second and third, is the judgment will impact just the people on the earth. So Dave is now going to talk about the universe one, judgment, and then he's going to talk about how the 2 laws of science interact with the creation and the fall. And he's going to do it in 35 minutes, and then we're going to go to lunch. Okay, let's hear it for Dave. All right, Dave.
Thank you. What's so interesting about this is the first 11 chapters of Genesis are taught at the academic level as being absurd from a historical and a scientific basis. What we're going to find out, and what I found out later, was that God has a jagged sense of humor, as I say, because he put all the laws of science in the first 3 chapters. When I was let me back up a little bit. In 1957, the Russians put up the satellite, Sputnik. It created a crisis. Eisenhower was the president, and they realized that if they could put satellites up, they could drop bombs on us. And they were building bomb shelters in homes, in public buildings. You'll still see the radiation symbols. They could nuke us. And so they tested all the junior high and high school students. And if you passed high on those in math and science, they invited you to free government camps, science and math camps taught by full professors, university professors. I was fortunate. I passed high, and I was got to go to these science camps, and they cranked it up. They were going to try and get us up so we didn't get beat by the Russians. And in these camps, because of that, I was able to pass high on my SAT scores and get into MIT. There were only 5 taken from the state of Kansas that year. This was back in '62, shortly after this impetus to get the students up to these higher levels. When I was there, I was recruited into a small fraternity. We had the highest grade point average at MIT at that time. And it was run like a monastery, no dating during the week. We had silent hours from 7 at night to 7 in the morning. We had previous exams, so you could study for this. And then you choose one of the seniors in my case, it was a fellow in the classmate above me as a tutor to help you along. Because when you hit there, we had the highest grade point, SAT scores in the nation. And you get there with all these geeks, the slide rule boys, and they weren't very social animals, Probably a third of them never married because of what are you going to talk about? Relativity and cosmology and everything. Anyway, I was studying there, and I was having great difficulties. I chose a fellow who's from China, born in China originally, a fellow named Richard Chin. I didn't know who he was. He was just a year ahead of me. And I was struggling. I knew that physics was the heart of science. Biology is a form of chemistry, just exchange of electrons. There's inorganic chemistry. But chemistry is a subdivision of physics because chemistry doesn't involve nuclear changes. Physics includes it all. And if you know your physics, you can do engineering, you can do science, you can do anything because it's the heart of science. And I was struggling. And so this Chin, I was just a C plus student. I was struggling. I worked hard to get a C plus. And so Chin sat down and he laid out for me. He says, let me see how you're doing your problem. So he'd slap these previous exams down. And I'd start to do my little equations of mechanics and electromagnetism and field theories and all this type of stuff. And he says, I know what your problem is. He says, the universe is only made out of two things, matter and energy. And there's only two laws that control all the laws of science. You can derive them from them. I said, what? And he said, the first law, in every interaction, there's only the same amount of matter before and afterwards. Same amount of energy before and afterwards. The universe cannot create or destroy any matter and energy. Okay? And these are the ideal laws, conservation laws they're called. And he developed for me gas laws, field theories, mechanical laws, Newton's laws. All these are ideal laws. And so I wanted to write my little formula. He says, no, what's conserved here? What's conserved there? And he says, but the real world is not ideal. We have a second law, and it's called the law of increasing entropy. Oh, I said, I recognize that. I recognize the first law. That's the first law of thermodynamics. That's the second law. Entropy is just a fancy word for disorder. In everything, you conserve the quantity, but the quality always declines. And that's why you can't just put fuel in your car and run forever. That's why the sun's burning out. Whole universe is burning out. And he says, and so they have a few, and he says, these professors are smart enough. They're paid the big bucks here at MIT to give you problems just using these two principles with a problem you've never seen before. You understand the principles, then you can solve the problems. And he regrouped me, turned me from I didn't even have to take in physics any final. I took it anyway because I was knocking them off in the intermediate exams using what he had taught me. So what we're going to find out, you know where those laws come from? The first 3 chapters. What happened on the 6th day? It's finished. Since that time, God finished it. He says, it's very good. There's no more matter, no more energy created since that time, and nothing's destroyed. There's no magic out there. What you got, what we have today, matter and energy in the whole universe, is the same that was on the 6th day. It's finished. And so you get 70 to 80% of your laws of science out of 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go into, well, why did it continue forever? Because of the fall. The second law comes from Genesis 3. He says, on the day that you'll eat of that, you will surely die. And it wasn't just man. The stars started to burn out. Everything starts this downhill run because God, when sin enters in, the universe starts to go down. He withdraws his maintenance. We don't know how he maintained it from the creation until the fall. But you know what? One day it'll return. We're going to see him recreate the universe after the final judgment so that it runs forever. And those that put their hope in him, that eradicate their sin, the consequences of it, will live forever. Who's the life there? Is there sun there? No. Is there a moon there? No. Is there life there? Yes, forever. Except there's another side. There's a lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And those that don't believe will be resurrected. They'll join that fire, and even hell itself will be cast into that lake of fire. But we have to understand, I read a book on Netanyahu, and he makes a classic, it's called Bibi, the leader that there's fighting everything, the whole rest of the world now. He made a classic statement. He says, how can you know where you're going to go unless you know where you've come from? And the problem today, in most of the people in the educational system, they don't know where they came from, and they don't know where they're going to go. Why do you think you have the scriptures? Do you know from the scriptures where we came from? Why we are what we are today, and where we're going to go? Everyone's going to go there, for better or for worse. So we have to understand the history. That's why we're concentrating on Genesis 1 through 11, to get everyone to understand this is history. We're not looking at a universe that's 13.7 billion years old. We're looking at one that's less than 8,000. You're not looking at Adam and Eve having parents. No, they're a creation. And every one of us here is one of their descendants, contrary to what Darwin and these other racists taught. We're all in the same boat. There's only two people, saved and unsaved people. Those whose sin is eradicated, to live in a universe which sin will be again eradicated and can go forever. Well, this is giving you a little bit of preface here. What happened before the flood? What did we have? Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. We always laugh. You know, everyone's big puffed up. Like Dan pointed out, we're just probably $20 worth of dirt and probably 5 gallons of water, you know. Some of you more or less. Look at me, I've got a little bit more. So that's what we are. And you know, when you have a graveside, what do they say? Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. We return back, our bodies do. But what else did we have? We had purpose. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to tend and keep it. In other words, work was a part even before sin came in. Most people don't understand it. They think work, oh, that's terrible. That's a judgment. But no, it's good for you. What do they say? The idle mind, the devil's workshop. So God supplied a place so we don't think of evil things. Also, and God said, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper compared to him. And that's why we have females. The human race, is two people. Contrary to the, LGBTQ plus or something like that. Didn't they read that? I mean, the human race won't continue unless you got a man and a woman. And we're complementary. I mean, I'm married with my wife here, and she does what I can't do, and I do what she can't do. But together we can accomplish a lot of things just besides having kids, you know. Also, there's the deal is innocence, and they were both naked, the man and the woman, and we're not ashamed. Like we said, God set up a perfect environment where the temperature is just right. You can walk around without any clothes, but you're in a state of innocence. This is the first law. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all the works that he had made. And then the first law, is what we're talking about, the law of science, is a historical event. Not only is it true, but it came from an historical event in Genesis. What's it look like? If you look at this thing, I don't have a deal to point out. Okay, what you have is a chart. In the upward direction is the total amount of matter and energy, and in this way, time, okay? And here we are at the present, and the amount of matter and energy, if it's an infinite universe, most people think that the universe is finite, but if it's infinite, you just use the energy density. Because what one part loses, the other one gains, and you've got a constant density in the universe. And it's for all time. 1,000 years ago, same amount. 1,000 years from now, if the Lord doesn't return, it'll have the same amount that we have today. Very simple law. Very simple law. Since the sixth day, there's no, as we said, no matter and energy is being created or destroyed. That's the first law. Simple law. The natural universe, as we said, is made of matter and energy, and these two laws have to do it. Now, this first law is called the quantity law of matter and energy, and it's just that it's called the conservation of matter and energy law. And it was first discovered in thermodynamics, by the way. Everyone thinks, oh, that's only applies to thermodynamics. No, like Chin explained to me, this is the law. It applies to mechanics, fluids, thermodynamics, electromagnetics, whatever you have, this is the same law. It was just discovered there first. And it states that basically there's the same amount of matter and energy in sum total before and after every interaction of matter and energy. And it's called, it's always constant for the whole universe. Implications. This is going to be an interesting. Where did it all come from? And this is, I don't know if you know Chesterton. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis's and those at Oxford. And he says it's absurd for an evolutionist to complain that it is unthinkable for an admittedly invisible God to make everything out of nothing and then pretend that it's thinkable that nothing turned itself into everything. I mean, that's what their position is. Everything came out of nothing. Is it more absurd than to believe that an invisible God created everything? No. It's not rational, because that's what their theory is. The universe arose out of nothing, all the matter and energy. It's a violation of the first law, by the way. Here's the important deal from the space technology.
During the 1920s, two of the most important discoveries in the history of science were made here at the Mount Wilson Observatory overlooking Los Angeles. For 8 years, astronomer Edwin Hubble photographed and studied the cosmos with the largest telescope in the world. In 1923, Hubble confirmed that mysterious formations called nebulae, widely believed to be enormous clouds of gas, stars, and dust within the Milky Way, were actually individual galaxies located far beyond our own. 5 years later, he verified that these galaxies were moving away from each other at fantastic speeds. Our universe, long thought to be eternal, static, and relatively small, was growing larger by the second. The implications were staggering. If the universe is continually expanding, then at some point early in its history, it must have been smaller and more compact.
If you reverse the outward motions of the galaxies and go backward in time, they come closer and closer together, and you reach a point finally where they're nearly infinite in density and temperature, and farther than that you can't go. So there's a beginning, there's a point in time from which it all started. And that's a remarkable thing because it has a very strong theological flavor to it. And that intrigued me because I am an agnostic, and if there was a beginning, a moment of creation of the universe, then there was a creator. And a creator is not compatible with agnosticism. And just as I can't believe that there was a creator, I can't believe that this all happened by chance, which implies there was a creator. So you see, I'm in a completely hopeless bind, and I've stayed there.
Robert Jastro's uncertainty was fueled by multiple discoveries that pointed to a universe created out of nothing and governed by laws of physics and chemistry, finely calibrated to ensure complex life.
Life is so extraordinary, especially advanced life, intelligent life. Conscious beings are such an extraordinary phenomenon that, again, I just qualitatively find it difficult to believe that they happened by chance. Think of your brain, for example. It's 3 pounds of matter, contains 1,000,000 trillion synapses, as I recall, circuits opening and closing all the time. It's so much more complicated than the most advanced artificial intelligence. Again, I find it hard to believe that this is all a matter of atoms and molecules. And so I try to fit into my concept of the world the conclusion that there is a larger force of some kind, which we can call God, or you can call it whatever. But I can't accept that. I'm what's called a materialist in philosophy. That doesn't mean I like Cadillacs and big cars. My students always used to think that. It means that I believe the world consists entirely of material substances. And when you specify those substances, the atoms and molecules, and the laws by which they interact, you've done it all. There isn't anything more to be said or inserted into your model of the universe. That's what my science tells me, and I've been a scientist all my life, but I find it unsatisfactory. In fact, it makes me uneasy. I feel I'm missing something, but I will not find out what I'm missing within my lifetime.
Robert Jastrow died in 2008. As the founder of NASA's Goddard Space Institute and the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, he helped to popularize astronomy throughout the world. In his best-selling book, God and the Astronomers, Jastrow described the philosophical conflict between scientific materialism and evidence for a universe that had a beginning. Far from disproving the existence of God, astronomers may be finding more circumstantial evidence that God exists, that the universe began abruptly in an act of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries.
From one of the most powerful men in science that was of my age with the space program, he's an atheist, an agnostic, that he acknowledges that the science points to a beginning, an act of creation, and of God. He can't accept it because of his philosophical deal, not his scientific knowledge. What do we have after the fall? And I don't have time to read the deal of the fall, but here are sections of it. To the woman, after the fall, they ate. They were set in the Garden of Eden, beautiful place. They could eat anything except of the one tree, knowledge of good and evil, but they ate of it. She ate of it. Satan deceived her. You see what Genesis 1 through 11 is about? It tells you a lot about everything, even Satan. He tempts her, and she accepts it. And it's not changed. You remember in 1 John 2, what is it? It's the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And he tempts her in the same way, and all of us are tempted the same way. Things that are nice to the eyes, pleasant to the flesh, and for the pride of life. And she fell for it. But these are the condemnations that God says. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall go bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. That doesn't fit into the feminist agenda. But it's sorrow and pain. To the man, he says, to Adam, he said, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat of the herb of the field, and in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. It's a curse. And then he says, and also to Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. There's death. Do you notice thing? God supplies, he's talking about atonement. What's the price of sin? Death. The animals had to die. And a word for atonement in Hebrew means covering. And it's only successful until the final one is paid, of Christ paying the final price, the perfection, paying the price for the sin, that we can escape from the consequences of it. And it says, lastly, he says, for he drove out the man and placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. In the flood, evidently, the world that existed, as we'll see, changed. The Garden of Eden doesn't exist. You don't have two big cherubs. Cherubim is plural, standing there with a swinging sword so that they didn't go in, and it's an act of grace on God. Do you imagine if Adam and Eve had lived in sin and lived forever in that state? Terrible consequences. It's really setting up the cherubim there, kept them from our ancestors from being locked forever, doomed in a world of consequence of sin. So what we have in this second law, remember the first law where the total amount is constant with time? The second law is the quality law. It is called increasing entropy. Like it says, it's a scientific word for disorder. It's always increasing disorder. It states there's always more disorder of matter and energy after an interaction than before. The quality or the order of matter and energy in the universe always decreases. And it could be explained this way. You see where it's coming down. We're at the present time, and it's an exponential decay towards zero. That's when all the stars burn out, all the universe, the energy is spread and matter throughout the universe. Basically, energy spread out through the whole universe. At present time, deep space is about 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. That's minus 460 degrees Fahrenheit, if you want an idea. And they say the estimate is when the stars all burn out, that temperature will rise up to about 4 degrees, absolute zero, which everything's frozen except hydrogen and helium. You have the same amount of matter and energy you have today, but it's no hot spots. It's all died. It all burned out. And if you go back, you have a very interesting point in time. You go back where you have the total amount of energy, the useful amount of energy equal to the total amount of energy. Do you know what the problem with that is? It can't exist before that point in time. You can't rise from total randomness, jump up to that point and begin to decline. You can't have no disorder and then all of a sudden begins. And you certainly can't go back and have more useful energy than total energy. This is science. And I don't have the time, I don't think, to explain. We'll do it later. I use this. I had a chance to speak to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the highest level, probably 4 or 5 years ago, presenting these laws. And they're all supposed to be atheists and everything. It's a killer. They're sitting there and looking at the laws of science. There's something the matter with this. It shows that there was a creation, just like Jastrow was saying. It's all science. This isn't philosophy. This isn't religion. This is science at its most basic root. This is what you have with these two laws. With the first law, you have two choices. Either the universe is eternal or it had a supernatural beginning. The second law eliminates the first choice. It says it isn't eternal. It had a beginning a finite time ago. Since the universe is not eternal, but rather it began a finite time ago and is now dying irreversibly, it's incapable of naturally restoring its order. There's only left this one feasible possibility. The universe was supernaturally created and ordered by an external agent, non-material, a finite time ago. Let's see more implications. It requires of this supernatural agent. It had that supernaturally created the universe and supernaturally gave it its order. You can draw some things from these two laws. Very interesting about the agent. One, it has to have more energy than the universe just to give it its order, not to create it. Like the sun, it's giving off energy. If you go back to its beginning, it's all concentrated here, okay? And then it begins this decline. Well, how much energy do you have to do to put the sun together? All the energy it'll ever give off. And if you do it for one star, you have to do it for all the stars. So this agent that put the stars and the galaxy together had to have more energy, not to create the matter and energy, but to give it order. Secondly, it has to be immaterial. People say, for instance, if you started out creating the universe over here and putting these stars together and traveling at the speed of light, by the time you get there, you'd be dead over there. You're covering too big of distances. So this agent can't, because matter can't travel faster than the speed of light. Okay? So this agent, if it was material starting over there, it'd be dead by that. This agent, and we know that we see these novas blowing up, these stars blowing up in every direction. We know that they all came into being at the same time. So no agent made out of matter could have started them. Well, some people say, oh, I believe that it was in the Big Bang when it was all together. I say, the temperature is so hot, if you believed in that there no matter can exist. There isn't, it's just disintegrated. At those temperatures that you have all the universe concentrated together, we have it together for a Big Bang, it's too hot. No atoms can exist, no electrons can exist, nothing can exist. So in any case, what's your conclusion? This agent is not made out of matter. Either it put it together, traveling fast at the speed of light, or it worked in conditions that was too hot to do it. Those are the things, too hot. Now, the other interesting thing, if I see a clock, I know two things. One of two things. Either there's a clock factory or there's a clock maker out there someplace. That clock doesn't happen by itself. Any system that's built, the agent that builds it has to be more complex than the thing. If I see a factory, I know there's a super engineer and an architect out there. But anything that's built, this is science. It's called information theory. And it comes out of the second law. Anything that's built, the agent that built it has to be more complex than the system is built. So you look at the universe, I don't believe in aliens, but if you look at man, as he's talked about, you know that agent is more complex than us. Has to be, any system. So it's more complex than man, has more energy than the whole universe. It has more, it's not material, and it's more complex than man. Well, what would we conclude at that point? One fellow said very clearly, I think we need to use the G word. And what other agent do you have? Immaterial, all this energy, and it's more complex than man. Emotions, feelings, intellect. Only a supernatural agent with the attributes of God fulfills these requirements, these scientific requirements. We've heard him, but shall I play this one more time? Okay, we don't have time. This fellow Stanford, I know him. He stayed with me. His son worked for me. He was probably the world's eminent geneticist, applied geneticist at one time. Brilliant guy. And he says the same thing. This law is not a pleasant law. It's not for intellectual contemplation. It's not for philosophical thinking. It affects each one of us. Like he says, we're all going to die Entropy is going to eat us all up. It'll eat up our universe. It'll eat up everything that we have here. I was invited to deal at the Kansas University to represent Christianity. It was by an atheistic group. And they were most of the people, there was a Buddhist, New Age person, modern Wicca person, there was a rabbi, and there was a atheist there. And I was representing Christianity. Well, in this, I got up, they all feel that we're good and good origins. And I said, no, man's basically bad. And that we're tearing the thing down. And the reason we're bad, society's bad, is not because it's independent. Society is a composition of all of us. So we're bad. And I said, from a scientific point of view, the universe is under this law that's going to take each one of us down. It's going to take our society down, and man will disappear, and eventually it'll take our sun and everything else down. I said, this law gives you no hope. And I said, the only exception I know to this, the permanent exception, I said this to the Chinese Academy of Science, the only exception you have is the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Otherwise, let's go out, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. There's no hope. There's no hope. This sin that our parents fell into, Adam and Eve, was irreversible, except for the coming of the Son of God to take away that consequence to each one of us. We're lost people, and we're in a lost world, and we have a lost destiny otherwise. So we're going to talk about the hope a little bit later. We got 2 more bad things going to happen here. So be prepared for it.
Hey, did you like that? A little preaching there. What do you think? A little preaching. Good job, man. Okay, are we listening? Are we listening? Did I get an amen on that? No. Okay, quickly.
What's up?
We just completed the first judgment. Adam and Eve's fall. The entire universe is dying as a result. Now we're going to talk about the entire earth, and we're going to talk about the flood. Dan, are you ready to start?
I am, and I know we got to make up some time, so you better hold on. First of all, you think the global flood actually happened? Why? Because the Bible said so? Okay, let's say you're not a believer. You can look at the evidence. Yeah, man, you can look at the evidence of billions of dead things buried in sedimentary layers, and there's no gap between the sedimentary layers. And I grew up in Arizona, and I used to go to the Grand Canyon stuff all the time, and so, my goodness, the same animals at the top in the fossil record are the same as at the bottom. That's one of the things I knew. Something's wrong with this whole situation, I'm being told. Okay, so let's just watch a little intro, but I am going to move very quickly through this so we can get everything in and you can see the tower and the Ice Age kind of stuff and all this other thing. Anyway, here we go. Let's get started. You can listen while you walk. It's okay. Here we go.
To some, the idea of Noah's flood conjures up images from Sunday school Bible stories of a small boat overstuffed with cute animals that gently bobbed in an ocean for 40 days. Many simply call it a myth. Fewer and fewer these days believe the flood account from Genesis 6 to 9 is actual history. The Bible frames the flood as an actual historical event, one that involved a specific family of 8. Genesis says the flood lasted for a full year, engulfed the entire world, and preserved animals, plants, and humanity from well-deserved judgment. The flood represents the most detailed account of any single event in the Bible. Both the Apostle Peter and Jesus even referred to the Genesis flood as a real historical event. So it's safe to say that the credibility of the Bible, and even Jesus himself, hinges on whether the flood account actually happened as described in Genesis.
There we go. that's going to be a problem, isn't it, for us if the flood didn't really happen, since we have 3 chapters, 88 verses, 8 people on the ark, which isn't recorded until Peter records that, affirms that for us. Genetics show us that we had a bottleneck about 4,253 years ago in which the humankind almost became extinct because it was such a narrow bottleneck of genetics. Gee, wonder what event happened about 4,253 years ago. The dates, the times, the numbers, the instructions on how to build the ark are significant. We're going to look at what the world was like before the flood, why the ark was the way it was built, the preparation God gave him for roughly 100 years to get everything in place before he pulls the trigger on this. You have fossils. Did everybody get a fossil that wants a fossil? You better get one. If you did not get one, Steve's going to wander around with some fossils. You keep your hands up over there. This is almost like Communion Sunday. Like, did you get the little thing with peel back the first part? It's kind of like that, isn't it? Isn't it, Tommy? It's just like that. Okay, we're going to get you hooked up. I want you to have one. Even if you don't want one, take it. You're going to know why later. We're talking about the evidence and the observations using the scientific method of how we know this flood happened and what occurred in the sequence, the impact of it is, and a conclusion at the end. You should be able to defend easily a global flood event after this presentation. If not, come see us. We'll talk about it some more. Okay, quickly. So we know we had one landmass. Dr. Brown covered that nicely for us, that the waters were separated right from the land, and we had this one landmass. Well, the tectonic plate structure we see today, tectonic plate sciences teach us that these things fit together like a puzzle. Gee, okay, that's in Genesis 1:9. So yeah, we did have that. We have this mention of Herahim, or higher hills, but not necessarily the character trait of a high mountain. So we kind of think we have high hilly places, but probably not the ginormous mountains we have today. We know that on the earth today, based on the coal seam ratios, think about this, the coal that's buried in the ground, we know that it takes so much coal to make a certain plant life to make a certain type of coal pressed down in dimension by ratios. Some of the really good stuff's in Michigan, where it's really packed tight. And some not. But we know we are looking at a world that only has about 3% of the vegetation it once had. How's that? Just based on coal seams. That's crazy, isn't it? Man, I can't wait to see this place lit back up again. It's going to be amazing. But we have that many more plants, that many more plants, you're probably going to have, what do plants produce? Yeah, they produce oxygen, right? Well, in these pieces of amber up here, that when you hold them up and look, you can see all these little air bubbles. Well, the U.S. Geological Survey did a study, and they found that, guess what? The bubbles in most of these samples that they're pulling have about 30% oxygen in them. So we've lost about 10% of that. So if you play football or sports or whatever, or distance run, taking in some extra oxygen really supercharge you. So these people not only were living with a hyperbaric kind of pressure and more moisture in their atmosphere that's going to help them heal faster, protect them from radiation, ultraviolet light, but they also had more oxygen. So our dragonflies with the spiracles in their side, we're homeschool moms, raise your hand. If I were an insect, I'd have a head. I'd have a thorax where my arms and legs plugged in. Have you ever heard that song? If not, some people think it's a miracle. I breathe through holes in my side called a spiracle. That's right. So these animals could grow enormous sizes, 3 foot across, because they had so much more oxygen, so much more plant life to eat. It's just a completely different world. It was a good place before the fall. Let's see what happens at the fall. Dave covered this a little bit, but I think I'll just go straight to this. The earth is full of what prior to the flood? What's the one what was the description of a world prior to the flood that's kind of unique? It's full of violence, isn't it? And Jesus is going to say later, it's going to be like the days of Noah. And I've always thought, man, it's going to get real violent before he comes back. Not just the earthquakes and all the other things, but there's this cultural thing going on. Demonic even, if you look at Genesis 6 with fallen angels and things. And it's a violent world. So the end of all flesh came before the Lord there. I'm going to read down here. For the earth is full of violence because of them, and behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. These evil folks that are doing this. But hold on, there's an ark of salvation, just like there is today with the Lord Jesus. So he very much represents, or the ark represents an illustration of who he is, covered with tar, cover our sins, and a place to go. And when the door closes, that's going to be it. And that's basically what happened here. And Noah didn't get to make that decision. The Lord himself does. But notice the ratio of this ark. It is 300 cubit by 50 by 30. Who's been to the ark encounter? If you haven't, you got to go check it out. It's in the middle of nowhere, like Kentucky, south of Cincinnati, but it's worth going. Ward and Sarah and my wife and I, we went together, and it was a real foggy morning, and the fog blew away, and we saw this thing. We were like, holy smokes, this thing is way bigger than I thought it was. But that using a Egyptian cubit, about 20.1 or 2 inches, which is probably what Moses would have recorded this with, that's about the size that this thing would be. But huge. Couldn't put it in the bottom of a football stadium. However, it's this ratio of 30 to 5 to 3. Which I'm just adding a 0 to kind of, but I'm telling you, it's just this elongated, narrow box, chest-like thing that he tells them. Now, they made it out of gopher wood there to make it out. Now, we don't know what species of tree that was because it probably may or may not have survived the flood. After the flood waters, we may have had gopher wood. But all I figured was this, that Moses pretty much told his sons, go for wood. Okay, so you got to be paying attention here. So, modern cargo ships, they follow this same ratio and standard. It's crazy. They follow this same dimensional design. A secular scientist from South Korea, a marine engineer from the University of Michigan said, you know what? I've done this study. That's his picture in the middle. This thing had a combination of max comfort, strength, and stability. If you use this ratio, you hit a center point in this triangle. Now, you think that was just by chance he told them to build it just that size? Doesn't so. Did it have to go anywhere, the ark? No, it just got to float and survive. However, Ray's smiling. He's liking this. However, our modern sea barges use the same ratios. They just kind of curve them more so they can move, but they give tremendous stability. The HMS Dreadnought, which became a whole class of battleships, was built using this to lob shells inland because it was so stable. Whole class of battleships were designed after this ratio. Just by chance? No chance. So one of the things you will often hear of naysayers is, well, you got all these tsunamis going on. If there was a flood event, multiple tsunamis, this thing would have capsized. So at deep sea, what's a tsunami like? Near an epicenter. Well, it's not as bad as you think. In fact, the waves may be 12, 15 feet high at the most, out in deep sea, but you get close to land where it gets shallow, it really gets wild, right? But that's not the situation these guys are in. They're going to be at deep sea. So the first time we've had historical evidence of this documented is off the coast of Japan, and they had their huge earthquake out at sea that caused the tsunamis. And so the Japanese Coast Guard goes out to the epicenter. They're going to try and document. They don't even know if they're going to survive, but they're going to the epicenter to see what a tsunami looks like at deep sea. And they think they're probably going to get smoked, right? Drowned out there. So I want you to listen as they see this tsunami wave near epicenter come toward them, and they're thinking, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're anticipating that the tsunami will just deluge us. Watch what happens.
10メーターだね。
Here comes. Here comes the wave. No. Hey, wait. It's not so bad. Wait. There's another one coming though. Oh, okay. So it's not that big a deal, man. I mean, this is the biggest one we would have recorded in our lifetimes. And it's like, oh, wait. So deep sea, what's a tsunami that begins at an epicenter of a shift in plates, causes this displacement of Earth beneath it, and it causes the ocean floor beneath it and causes the waves. Well, if you're out there and it's deep, it doesn't really matter. So they can endure all kinds of tsunamis easily with this vessel. So when we get to, now the other question is, well, gee, Ward, how did they get all these animals on the ark? Aren't there like, 10 million animals and stuff? Isn't that right? How the heck did they fit them in this little ark that's the size of a football field? What do you think? Ward's going to tell you about the animals.
Well, I think that to get the job done, they call in a farm boy that's used to carrying animals around. So here I am. At the doors, when you came in, there were some printed handouts, an outline. I'm not going to follow that at all. That is just to provide information for you that you can read through, that's going to maybe put it in an order and a fashion of which is different than the Bible. It's going to be the same information, but it's going to be there. So if you didn't get one, you can pick one up now or later on. If we run out, Josh will make some more copies. So, okay, ark capacity in the animals. Let's look at the feasibility of being able to get the animals on a big boat this size. And let's read this first. You shall take with you 7 pairs of every clean animal, a male and his female, and 2 of the animals that are not clean, a male and his female. Also of the birds of the sky by 7s, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of the earth. So, and male and female by 7s, that would mean 14 would be the numbers there. So, okay, no pressure, Noah. Just you're going to send them to you. You just build a boat, and then you just keep them alive. That's all you have to do. Now, used to say that Noah was an amazing, the ultimate prepper. If any of you are preparing for big catastrophes or crises or anything like that might be coming up, like a hurricane's coming up, you're going to be prepping. What was Noah's secret, best tip, hack, so to speak, to be the prepper? The ultimate, follow Plan G, capital G, and follow to the T. Noah was obedient. So that was what it's boiled down to. Noah was obeying God. So let that be a lesson to all of us. Let's follow Noah and obey God when we're prepping. So this is from an article, a more recent article, out of Answers in Genesis. If you want to take a picture of that, then up here, this QR code right up in here, that will get you to the article. And then this chart and slide was made from that article. This is talking about the number of animals that's going to go on the ark, and talking about in the terms of kinds. So we have brought you to the point of reason why that we talk about kinds so much. Remember, only 2 dogs had to go in the ark for all the canine, or 2 canine kinds. 2 feline kinds had to go in the ark to give us all of the tigers and lions and down to the domestic cats, bobcats, and all those type of things. So now you can get the understanding of which our biggest number, or our biggest things to keep in mind with this, is that as we come up from the bottom, there's about 1,398 or 1,400 kinds that went onto the ark. And this is determined by baraminologists, that people that study created kinds, put together by a group at Answers in Genesis. And they come up with this 1,400 kinds on the ark. And with a total to give us almost 7,000 or 6,744 total animals. Now this farm boy, I think that sounds feasible, that we can be able to do that. And so it's something here that those are the two biggest numbers to be aware of. 1,400 kinds, 7,000 animals to go into the ark and to give us all of the different animals that we see nowadays on the earth. Now, what was being destroyed at the time were the animals or the ones on the land in which took in breath by their nostrils. And not sphericals, but nostrils. So that's the ones which God had mentioned to take onto the ark and be able to save at that point in time. A couple of other things that the article points out is it does point out that the animals that went onto the ark, if we look over here, in the red, those are extinct. So they went on and came off the ark. Of the 7,000 went on the ark, 2,900 are extinct today, 43% of them. And then almost, the 4,000 or the 57% are living today, the ones that came off the ark. So unfortunately, a lot of them did not make it, and a lot of them are going to be dinosaurs went on the ark, and most of those are dead and gone. And so that is the big thing here. So I won't be able to go through all the details of all the different types of animals, but just to be aware of that they're talking about our different classes, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds that were on the ark. So I think it's feasible. I think it's doable. Let's look at some other things which can make it seem like it's more doable. We have our sheep dolly up here, and the reason why is because it's estimated that the average size of the animal that went on the ark would have been about the size of a sheep. So you start with the pocket pets, the hamsters, gerbils, things like that you carry around in your pocket in grade school, and then you go on up to the bigger animals like the big dinosaurs, but they're in a juvenile form. They're small, they're younger. They are not have to start out with as an adult size, so they can be a lot more compactable, easy to take in. So average 120-pound sheep. Think about that. And Dan already gave you the dimensions of the ark, and then to give a comparison here. Oftentimes there's a comparison. You'll see it will be cargo. Cars like on the train, box cars, or we've used a semi-trailer as a capacity measure. And it looks like 450 semi-trailers, just the trailer portion of them, can be able to fit inside the ark. That's cubic feet inside that ark, to give you a little illustration there. 250 sheep per trailer, 450 of them. So if you pack them in like they're hauled around now on trucks, we wouldn't do that. God wouldn't have Noah do that. This farm boy wouldn't do that. It wouldn't be humane for him to be on a great big box boat for over a year. But this shows you that it would hold over 112,500 sheep as a feasibility aspect. If we put those trucks together, bumper to bumper, 6 miles long, if we watch them drive down the highway, speed limit safe distance apart. We'd have probably about a 45-minute parade to watch go by. So to give you an idea, there's a lot of space on that ark. If you've been to the Ark Encounter, some of this will look familiar. These are pictures from the Ark Encounter. So if you've been there, you're already ahead of the game. You already know most of this information and have been there, and that's so nothing surprising to you all. You've already done the math and know it can be done. So it just gives you an idea of what the interior could look like, or is thought to look like on the ark there. Now, this reading here, for those that are paying attention, these verses, this is Genesis 6. The first one I read was Genesis 7. Not that we're trying to play games or anything to that effect, but this is going to be talking about food. And that's, so we're talking about kinds and then talking about the food. So as for yourself, some of all food which is edible, and gather to yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. So, as I was talking about on day 3 last night, the plants are food for the animals, written here. So that's a food for you, food for the animals. And they didn't have to take along any meat at that time for some of the animals, some of the like the canine kind or the feline kinds. And the reason why is because God had not allowed it to be something which they were going to be able to eat any meat. So they didn't have to have meat. They're all omnivores. They're all vegetarians at that time. So the food is going to be the same thing as what probably we would be eating, they would be eating, and Noah would take that along. And as mentioned earlier, these smaller ones are going to be the ideal ones to take along. They're going to occupy far less space, regardless of the kind. They're going to sleep more. They're too young to procreate, and it's going to take less water, less food, and less waste. There's going to be less waste involved with it there. So, do you think it can be done? Yes, feasible. The other thing, too, that's a good thing, is that God divinely selected those animals to send them to the ark. Selected for temperament, selected for the age, selected for the individual, and things to that effect. And as the animals would go on the ark, and then when they do go on the ark, when they've already been used to being around Noah, but did they have the fear of man at that time in the animals? The animals did not have the fear of man instilled in them until after the flood, until after they came off the ark. So they would go on the ark, no reason to be super scared of people, but then they would also, when animals, and probably your dogs don't know, the ones whose dogs don't sleep with them, do your dogs go in a kennel? Do they like to do some dogs like to go into a wire cage kennel, and that's their secure place. And then they lay down, they calm down. Same thing for a lot of animals. They'll go into there. They'll be in a confined area or a compartment area. They'll calm down. They'll go in a hibernation type of a mode and that. So there's much we could talk about with this. There's a book by John Woodmore, The Feasibility of the Ark. And that, if you're interested in looking at that further out there. So right now, let's go ahead and have Dan come back up, and he'll make it start raining.
Now we're all set. We've got our animals. We know, will the animals fit on the ark? Of course they will. We know from genetics we just need a nice pair of genetically rich kinds, and they can go on down and become 400 different kinds of dogs someday, right? Okay, so this is the flood the beginning of it, and it's a nice representation of how this would have happened from the springs of the deep to the collapse of our canopy to our rain, and how this happens. Here we go.
600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. These two events, the fountains of the great deep breaking up and the windows of heaven opening, began the first day of a 371-day-long calamity that resurfaced the earth and killed everything that moved on land. Hot magma mixed with steam pierced the earth's crust. Giant rifts or tears ran thousands of miles across the planet. Scalding hot magma vaporized massive amounts of water that jetted into the atmosphere. The water fell back to Earth as intense global rain, along with torrential rain from heaven for 40 days. Worldwide catastrophic rifting caused massive mud-filled tsunamis to speed across deep ocean floors, then onto shallow ocean floors, killing everything in their path. The first mega-sequence wipes out mostly shallow marine habitats. The bursting fountains of the great deep spew out megatons of magma and carbon dioxide. Sure enough, the first mega-sequence rocks show a spike in volcanic activity and massive amounts of carbon dioxide. During these first 40 days, intense water currents overtopped most of the flooded continents. Water-laden sediment travels at highway speeds. Thick sediment blankets start covering low regions of the continent. Fossils show that the first 3 mega-sequences buried the shallow seas that were filled with marine life, as these deposits have almost no trees or land animals.
Okay, so what were the first animals to die? The marine animals, right? Like 98, 99% of all fossils we find are marine animals. Who has a marine fossil today? You all do. That's where you better. If you don't, we're going to make sure you take one home. So the fossil record shows all these marine animals at the bottom from a secular geologic column representation. Why? Because they're the first ones that died. They're shoaling animals, and they get buried by the first flows of the mud. Now we can track with geology and sedimentary layers across all the continents with these boring holes. We're boring for oil and other things on all these different continents, and we're seeing this repeated sequence of layers, which tells us it's a global event because we see the same layer in Kansas as we do, let's say, in Brazil. Right? So that's what this is going to talk about, the flood sequence, what we believe happened based on the evidence.
Join us now as we reveal how Noah's flood lines up with brand new scientific research. Over 1,800 oil well boreholes from 4 continents have all been compiled and mapped. The newly emerging map tracks the thickness and extent of each rock type as they were laid down by the flood. This research reveals the same 6 mega-sequences of sedimentary rock deposits across multiple continents. Each mega-sequence contains a huge stack of rock, often with coarse-grained sandstone on the bottom, then finer-grained deposits like shale, then topped by limestones. Each mega-sequence is bounded above and below by flat, eroded surfaces called unconformities. A few places on Earth have layers that represent all 6 mega-sequences. How did they get there? What do they say about Noah's flood? Catastrophically water-deposited sedimentary layers top most of the world's continents. Would Noah's flood bring lots of water and lots of mud? Geologists agree on the 6 mega-sequences, but they differ on the timescale in which they happened. If they took millions of years, then they have little to do with the flood. But if they were all deposited rapidly and recently, then the flood should come to mind. Many also question when a larger landmass, such as a Pangea-like supercontinent, broke into continents that moved to their current configuration. For the first time ever, new mega-sequence maps allow us to see how the flood shaped our entire planet.
Do you notice there, I've been to India, went there for a wedding, and you notice this movement of this plate that slams into that landmass over there where India is, and at great velocity. What do you think happens to sedimentary layered pancakes of mud layers when there's a lot of pressure both from below because of the weight, these being lighter than the elements below them, being pushed up by a plate slamming into a continent? It forces things up in the air. And so if that were true, Baumgartner's stuff, then we should see these layers all over the earth, and we would think it was a quick, catastrophic thing, as opposed to a geologic column millions and millions and millions of years. Doesn't look like it actually happened that way. There's a lot of reasons why. We'll talk about that. We've already done this. You already have your fossils. So who has a sea snail? There they are. There they are. You're probably holding a sea snail from Morocco, and it's well over a mile above sea level, and it's supposed to be 500 million years old. You know what the big problem is? They still look like the sea snails we got today. Notice the attributes of the fossils you're holding in your hand. They're all a mile above sea level. They're from every continent in the world, and they look exactly the same as they do today, as they did 500 million years ago. We got a problem if we're on that. Okay, how about clams? What happens to clams on the seashore around here when you find them? Bivalves. They die, and the little tendon that holds them together, let's go, and you usually find one half of one shell. What do you notice about your clams? Who's got a clam like this? Or a bivalve of some kind, an interesting bivalve. Okay. What do you notice about yours? He's closed. He was alive when he got buried. So fast he couldn't even pop open. Buried quick under 40 feet of mud. Just like that. Most of the clams we have are our mollusks from Black Mountain. Some of your guys, if you have kind of like a really cool kind of indention on those, they're probably from those Atlas Mountains in Morocco as well, okay? All hundreds of millions of years old, all a mile above sea level, all killed alive and buried under deep layers of sediments, and all look exactly the same as they do today. How about a crinoid with like the little stems that look like a stack of dimes? Does anybody have some of those? Who's got any of those? There you go. So you're talking about like a feather duster or a sea lily. That's the stems of these. They look the same way today. But these are on top of mountains, 485 million years. Kentucky. What? Yes. Oceans on the top of Black Mountain, Kentucky, with sea lilies or feather dusters. That's where your crinoids come from. In Kansas, we have them out just a little bit west of Lawrence at Clinton Lake by the dam. You can find all kinds of these, Dave, if you ever want any of those. You don't have any royal ferns, but I've got one up here. They look exactly the same. That's from Pennsylvania. Who's got a sea snail? Looks like kind of like your garden snails here. Who's got one of those? There you go. You're probably looking at Madagascar here for yours, over a mile above sea level. Does anybody have an ammonite? Kind of a curly little, you've got one? You're lucky. That's Himalayan, man, so usually. So that's like 2.5 miles above sea level, although they can go all the way up to 5 miles above sea level. Those are the real mountain clammers right there, right? But they look exactly the same today in the Philippine Sea as they did before, and I've got some really great evidence for you. You can look at up here if you ever have time between all these things. Let me see, grab one of these like that. Okay, so what we see is these things, they get really big. I've got a large one up here, but they look exactly the same. They have the same little modules in them as they did then, but yet they're supposed to be 550 million years and they never changed. What the heck's going on? I guess they must have just been born perfect. Didn't need to evolve. But you find them on the top of mountains in the Himalayas. Okay, so here's our evidence. We see the tectonic plate evidence. We can see how these plates fit together prior to the oceans of the deep breaking up. We see these sea creatures on top of the mountains. And now we see a little clue in Psalm 104 where it says, at the God's rebuke, he's going to force off the water from these rising mountains that happen from the plate interactivity. And the mountains rise and the valleys sink and the water runs off. So there's another phase to this where there's a lot of runoff. So the surface levels of what the flood would have laid down, several layers have probably got washed off into the oceans. That's where a lot of maybe our mammals and human fossils probably ended up, several hundred miles offshore and thousands of feet deep, most likely. But I think it's interesting if you look, You'll see the closed shells because they were buried alive. You'll also see these pancake stacks that are tilted up like this in mountains. Now, the only way you can get sedimentary layers to do that without breaking is if they're still soft when it happens, and there's a lot of pressure on them from these plates slamming into each other. And so that's exactly what we'd observe if this was true, and we do see that. So here's a little bit more about this.
The fact that over a dozen states in the U.S. are filled with dinosaur fossils buried under heaps of mud also attests to the flood. In fact, geologists have found a temporarily exposed dinosaur peninsula, where the dinosaurs made their last stand, now buried there along with lake and sea life transported by the massive waves. The earlier flood deposits, the first 3 megasequences, do not seem to have deposited much material over this dinosaur peninsula. Only a few hundred yards of sediment remain along the margins, and in many places, no deposition is left at all. Deposits thousands of feet thick occur east and west of this temporarily exposed peninsula that extends from Minnesota to New Mexico. Now buried across it are pre-flood wetland plants and animals, including dinosaurs, turtles, frogs, fish, and many birds. Thousands of dinosaur trackways up and down this peninsula, plus similar temporarily exposed low areas on other continents, suggest that dying dinosaurs and other hardy track makers floated, waded, and walked on freshly deposited mud, trying to find safe ground. Next, the massive Zuni megasequence hits. The Absaroka and Zuni megasequences are the most severe because the continental plates began to move more quickly from the original Pangaea-like supercontinent configuration to where they are today. With oceanic rifting and plate subduction increasing dramatically, and the continents traveling apart quickly, the tsunami-like waves began washing across western North America, while virtually no sedimentation is occurring in the east. When coming up over the Dinosaur Peninsula, the Zuni catastrophically buries dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation, a 13-state area encompassing over 700,000 square miles. This Jurassic unit includes at least 141 massive dinosaur boneyards, where dinosaurs like Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Allosaurus are found. The Cretaceous layers, like the Hill Creek Formation, are found on top of the Jurassic and hold hundreds of mass boneyards containing several different types of dinosaurs, such as T-Rex, Triceratops, Centrosaurus, and Edmontosaurus that had been living in a different ecosystem, also buried by the Zuni. The Zuni was so massive and fast that it engulfed entire regions with mudflow, burying giant creatures like this T-Rex under 50 feet of muddy sediment, entombed so quickly that preserved blood cells, blood vessels, and bone cells were found just recently. How much water does it take to pile 50 feet of mud on top of a dinosaur? The Dinosaur National Monument in Utah contains thousands of visible bones from 11 kinds of dinosaurs that were buried in a jumbled mass in the Morrison Formation, together with crocodiles, turtles, lizards, frogs, and clams. What type of event would it take to bury all these different land animals with millions of clams? When the
Okay, now wait a minute. Nobody told me that the possums and everything were buried alongside T-Rex. Did you ever see that in school when you were growing up? No. You know, there's this kind of mysterious jungle-like swamp place where all the dinosaurs live, and then millions of years later, you know, something else happens. Do you know we're finding dinosaurs now in China, like a Compsognathus? Who are my dinosaur kids? What's a Compsognathus? Do you know what that one is? He's kind of a small, raptor-like guy that runs around and eats things. Guess what was in his stomach that they just found here in China in the last year or so? Birds. Dude was running around eating birds for dinner. Well, I thought they were supposed to, that's what happened to the dinosaurs, they will tell you. They evolved into birds. No, they weren't. They were eating them. So that's not really happening. So we had this, what's called the fire rim, or the ring of fire that goes around the continents. Why do you think we had all these volcanoes? How many active volcanoes are there on the earth today? What would you guess? Somebody. 600. Okay, well, there's like roughly 1,200 to 1,500 depending on the day, but about 1,200 probably is a good number right now. But during the flood, there was a lot more. Thousands of volcanoes going off because we had all of this plate movement and this ripping of the seabed and the creation of it and the subducting of all this stuff underground. we have all of this volcanic activity, and volcanoes eject what? They eject aerosols into the air. And after the flood, these things are going to enable a special event, and it's the best explanation for it, with hot seas evaporating into the air. You're going to block sunlight, and it's going to get really cold in the northern hemisphere, and that water's going to fall not as rain, it's going to fall as snow, and it's going to pack, and we're going to get something called an ice age. So the flood's a great example of what that is, and Dave will talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute, but let's just continue on and work our way through this.
150th day of the flood, God made a wind to pass over the earth. The waters started to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now enters the final mega sequence, the Tejas. Here, after the water peaked over the top of the highest remnant of the pre-flood world, it began to rush off the continents, eroding and reworking some of the deposits laid down in the previous mega sequences, especially carving away at the Zuni deposits. This final sequence appears to have been different than the others, because there was a reversal in flow direction as the waters began to sheet off the continents. This flow reversal transported much of the fossils deposited earlier off the highest uplands, spreading them towards the edges of the continent. The evidence points to the Tejas draining the floodwaters southward off of the U.S. towards the Gulf of Mexico, with a sheet wash pattern all at once. This is why we find massive sand deposits in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of barrels of oil have been discovered there, with much of it found within a massive 1,100-foot thick bed of pure sand in over 7,000 feet of water, over 200 miles offshore. In addition, plants swept off the pre-flood lands formed massive coal beds, such as in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana. These Tejas layers contain the largest coal deposits in North America that currently supplies over 40% of the coal in the U.S. Some of these stacked coal beds are up to 200 feet thick and cover areas that are 60 miles long by 60 miles wide.
Wait a minute now. If you've got a coal bed that is 200 feet thick, and it's arguably at least 5 to 1, how tall is the stack of logs floating around that gets buried by the mud? If it's a 5 to 1 ratio, even for the poor boy coal, and it's 200 feet thick in a coal seam pressed down, how big was that stack of logs? 1,000 feet thick. That's what happened to these forests. They got ripped off at their roots by mudslides. You're going to see how that happened in just a moment. But I want to talk about coal seams. So when we find these coal seams, what's fascinating is above them and below them, there's sedimentary rock, which means sand that was laid down and compacted. There's no erosion between these layers, so it wasn't some swamp that sat there for 500 million years and brontosaurs ran around in it, and we read about them in books as kids, and they just kind of, slowly over time formed these things. There's no erosion between these layers. They are buried within sedimentary rock laid down by moving water and sand, okay, not wind or anything like that. And there's no tree roots that we find in these coal seams. Why would that be? We learned that from Mount St. Helens, that it shears off these mud flows and slides, shear the trees off and leave the roots behind. And so you have these floating logs, just like you'd trim them up, if you're going to burn them in a fire pit or something. And so that's why all these things happen. It was obviously a rapid process, and every coal seam in the world is exactly like this. By the way, there's no burrowing and there's no meteorites either in these, which means they didn't sit there for very long. The moles didn't even have a chance to burrow down or anything. It's just one thing over another, like pancakes. So here, let's look at how we got Grand Canyon. This is kind of the last sequence when the water's running off and the mountains are being pushed up and the water's going to run off the continents, and it's going to cut like butter right through pancake-stacked, sedimentary mud-laid rocks. We would say rocks now, but at the time they're soft, they're pliable, they're bendable, and this huge inland trapped lakes of freshwater get run off the continents, and they go running right through these areas, and you have a real quick creation of a canyon. So here we go.
Most people have heard the theory that the Colorado River has been flowing through the canyon, eroding it very slowly over the period of tens of millions of years. That theory has been popular, but most geologists now have junked that theory and are going to a different theory to explain the origin of Grand Canyon. There are many, many theories out there for how Grand Canyon was eroded, but most geologists are dissatisfied with the idea of the millions of years river. Geologists are speculating that Grand Canyon formed rapidly. There are various ways that it may have formed. The one I like is the idea that there was a great lake of water upstream from the Grand Canyon in the Hopi Desert area, and this lake drained through the plateau in northern Arizona. It breached a dam and drained through the area of the Grand Canyon, 270 miles long, an enormous spillway and drainage of lakes to the east and to the north. Grand Canyon may be explained by catastrophic process, and Mount St. Helens, with the breached dam and the mud flow that occurred, might be a good example. Grand Canyon could be a gigantic breached dam formed by rapid drainage of water from lakes. And it's illustrated by the landscape here at Mount St. Helens. We see at Mount St. Helens the landslide debris that was blocking the valley and the mud that overtopped and breached a dam, creating a spillway with a whole new series of canyons, even a miniature Grand Canyon. So Mount St. Helens provides a model for how Grand Canyon was eroded.
Okay, so I grew up in Arizona, man. So I ran distance when I was in school, and our coach, Jerry Jopsky, who ran for USC, he held the record for running up and down the Grand Canyon. So guess where he took his kids to train them? He took them up to northern Arizona. I was down in the valley in Mesa, and we'd go up here and we'd run this kind of back and forth cross back kind of thing and go down to the bottom and then come back and have something to drink and hang out and encourage one another and then do it and come back out again. But it always bothered me as an evolutionary kid that the animals that I would see, especially the squids, which are kind of cone-shaped looking things, you'd see them at the top. And you run all the way down to the bottom and you'd see the same animals in the layers down there. And it just didn't make any sense, you know. One of the cool things about it is you'd see them, I've shared this before, but you'd see them, they have these little cone-shaped heads, and sometimes you catch them where you can actually see their bodies, and they'd be all going this way. All of them going this way. Not over millions of years, they were all getting blown along by the water current and then buried alive, all going this way. And then you'll go down, you might go, I don't know, a third of a mile down, and you'd see the same things again, and guess what? They'd be all going this way. It's like the water was kind of flushing back and forth, and they were getting trapped in these layers and buried alive. But it's a great example that you can't just think about it as, okay, where's this flood? I know we all want to simplify it and say, oh, there's this flood, and there's all this water, and it was all stacked layers of sediments, and all these animals buried by the order in which they died, not millions of years of evolution. So we know that's true because of the soft tissue and everything else in these specimens. But here's what's interesting is there's a lot of water trapped inland, and so as these cataclysmic events are happening and mountains are coming up and stuff, that water's got to go somewhere. It's trapped inland in a big lake, and it gets washed off, and it just washes itself right through a bunch of soft sediments and just blows away everything. And a lot of the fossils and the dead animals and things that were on those top layers, they get blown all the way out into the Gulf of Mexico in the example here. And we know that because we can find stuff down there like oil and stuff, dead animals and stuff down there. So that's probably where a lot of the human fossils are, although there's a lot of neat kind of things that have been found in coal seams, like little idols and bells and things. What the heck are those things doing in coal seams? Hate to say this. It's kind of a sad theory, but I think it's probably true. What the heck would a little idol or a bell or something be in a coal seam? It seems like maybe some of those remaining people that were blown away by the flood were hanging on to these mats of floating logs or something and hanging on to their little idols. They end up in the coal. So, I'm not saying we heated our homes with those people or anything like that, but I'm just saying it's possible. So we have this evidence. So we have our coelacanth. By the way, you have glass screens. We're not used to this. We're used to fabric screens so we can put our pointer on there and see things, but I'll just go around the edges and do it this way. So we see these guys that were buried in look like this at the time of our T-Rex and all of that, and yet we find them in the Indian Ocean. And if you even look close, you can see there's the fin is kind of tucked in, but he's got the same fins and all. When I was a kid, this was the coelacanth was the land fish, he kind of walked off into the ocean, man, or he walked out of the ocean and became us somehow. No, these animals look exactly the same as they always did. Really sad situation here, but ichthyosaur, so it's kind of like, think dolphin-like. It's giving birth to a child, and it's buried alive with the baby still in the birth canal. You think that was a catastrophic event? Oh, you better believe it. Look at those bent layers. How do you do that? Well, you get a bunch of soft layers of sedimentary rock layers laid down like pancakes, and then you ram into it with a tectonic plate from another continent coming in and slamming into it, and things happening from the beneath up, and it pushes up, and it bends these layers without breaking them. Obviously a catastrophic event with lots of mud. And so now we have our ammonites here, or our nautilus, you might say, and there they were at like 5 miles above sea level in the Himalayas. Well, at the end of all things, sad epitaph here, Genesis 7, 21 to 24, all flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds, cattle, beasts, every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, and mankind as we knew it, except for the 8. Of all that was on the dry land and all whose nostrils had the breath of life, they died. And thus he blotted out the living things that lived upon the face of the earth. They were probably genetically corrupted from a demonic standpoint, probably trying to eliminate a line to a Messiah from Genesis 6 with Nephilim and interpreting it as all the first and second century believers did, that they were monkeying around with genetics. Geez, that's how familiar people are monkeying around with genetics to bring about destruction? No, it couldn't be, right? Okay, so blotted out all these things, all the birds of the sky, blotted these out, except for what? Only Noah was left together with those that were on him on the ark, and the water prevailed on the earth for these 150 days, and then it ran off, and he blew the wind and dried it out. So what's the conclusion? What do we see from scientific evidence? We see tectonic plates, we see soft tissue, we see animals eating other animals. At the same time, they get buried alive, like these fish, or giving birth. And yeah, we got a problem. Which one do you think is fact? Do you think these layers, like the Coconino sandstone that's in the Grand Canyon, that goes all the way to the Appalachians, do you think it was a big flood? Or do you think it took millions of years to create these little layers? What do you think? Was it millions or billions of years, or do you think it happened fast? Well, you're holding something that was alive and didn't even know what happened, and it was just buried alive, just like that. And how do you get trees like polystrate fossils that show up going through different layers of sediments? They'd had to have done that for millions of years and still be a tree growing. Probably not happening that way. So this is fascinating to me. So Peter records this, 2 Peter records this. They didn't just like, yeah, I'm not going to pay attention to that dude. They deliberately, this is first century, right? He's saying these dudes are deliberately overlooking the fact that the heavens, long ago, and the earth was formed out of water. Where did we hear that? Genesis 1, we have a water ball. Guess what God did with the flood? He took it back to the studs. It's Genesis 1 again, 1:1 even, and 2. It's a water ball again, and now he's starting all over again, just like he did. It's like a rebirth of the entire earth. Okay. So, just as he formed it out of water, through water by the word of God, he made us, he made the earth and all that's in it. And by means of these things, the world that existed then, what? It was deluged with water and it perished. And he says that they deliberately overlooked this fact. They don't want to think about judgment coming. Is that anything like what we're dealing with today? Jesus is this ark of salvation we're headed to. Perhaps one of the hardest verses to read is in, I believe it's the 7th chapter, and where Noah gets in with all the animals and all that, and it says what? It says, and the Lord shut him in. He shut the door. You know, if you're Noah, ain't no way you could have closed that door, because you know Sam that lives up on the hill there, man, I've been talking to for 100 years, and he doesn't want to come with his family and his kids and stuff. Look at the grace of God to close the door without him knowing when it was actually going to happen and not having him have to close that door. Could you close the door on your neighbors that don't know the Lord? There's a day coming, and you won't know the day or time, but it's coming. You see the signs of these things, because Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, that's when it's going to be like. The world will be full of violence. There's going to be some people overlooking these things, don't want to hear about it. The sad but wonderful thing is, God is so full of grace and love for you, He's going to close the door for us. He will close that door on salvation in Christ. Christ, the ark of our salvation, right? And when it happens, it'll be on His time schedule. And we don't get to call that shot. But there's probably people out there that you really should, He has moved in your heart, placed you in the boundaries in which you live, in such a time as this, that you'd reach for Him, though He's never far away, like Acts 17, but also for the purpose that some might be saved. That's what He's waiting for. It's not His heart that any should perish, but all should be saved and come to repentance, right? So that's really His heart. Now, are all people going to accept that? No, they're not. And they didn't then. But isn't it interesting that Jesus said it's going to be just like it was in the days of Noah? Full of violence.